Scream 7 is a bit of a mess, and I'm here to talk a little bit about why that might be the case. Does it even matter? Can you enjoy it? How to enjoy it? I don't know. Pick one, right? Even and how to rationalize even if you don't like it. My name's Jakub, and I'm just a guy with a microphone, a camera, and a crippling sense of insecurity, and a massive bout of stage fright. Trying to make sense of the movies I watch, right? But before we do any of this, follow, subscribe, ring the bell, like, share, I don't know, comment. Leave a comment, Do you agree or disagree with what I have to say? I don't know. Tell me what you think, It could be like a multi-dimensional experience, but, do that. This is what people do on YouTube, I suppose. And also, check out my website here. Check out my podcast here, But yeah, okay. Scream 7. Basics. I've waited a little while to actually, gather some, courage to talk about it that way. But yeah, released on February 26th, 2026, so a few weeks back. And this movie has become a bit of a weird lightning rod. And I think this is an important sort of, I don't know if it's important, but I think it's an interesting enough sort of topic for me to kind of just like, hey, let's just talk about it for just a brief second, right? Because there's more to it, right? This movie is the 7th installment in a franchise that's this year exactly 30 years old. This summer, Scream will turn 30, okay? So it's been around for a while now, right? Originally directed by Wes Craven, I think he did for the first 4, and was co sort of produced or co-invented with Kevin Williamson, who wrote the first 2. This one is directed by Kevin Williamson, stars Neve Campbell, Courtney Cox, Isabel May. Isabel May plays her daughter Tatum. Matthew Lillard makes an appearance, more on that in a second. And a bunch of other people, Mason Gooding, Jasmine Savoy Brown, a few other folks, right? And it essentially forgets that Scream 5 and Scream 6 ever existed. That's kind of the big shtick behind the film. This is a movie that wants to rewrite history. It starts with Stumacher's house being burnt down to the ground by the new Ghostface killer, almost in a visual sort of acknowledgement that the past no longer matters. We're in uncharted waters. We're rewriting as we go along. And boy, did they, right? So this movie sort of... So this movie essentially forgets Scream 5 and Scream 6 existed, essentially pretends that Melissa Barrera's character, Sam Carpenter, doesn't really factor into anything, and it reconnects, and more on that in a second as well, and reconnects with Neve Campbell's character, Sidney Prescott, who's now a mom to a 17-year-old girl whose name's Tatum, named after her best friend, who's played by Rose McGowan in the original film, so that's a connection to the original already. And their family is, once again, the tradition dictates they're stalked by a ghost-faced killer. This time, very quickly revealed to be someone who looks like Matthew Lillard's character Stumacher, right? That's kind of the big driving force of why this movie kind of looks the way it does is they managed to get Matthew Lillard back for this. But more on that in a second too, okay? So the movie is directed by Kevin Williamson, so Matt Bettinelli Olpin and Tyler Gillette. Apologies, I'm gonna say Gillette, okay? These two guys, they don't come back to direct it. Kevin Williamson did. More on that in a second. And the screenplay is written by James Vanderbilt and Guy Busick. These two actually have written Scream 6 and Scream 5. So I think, they are kind of like the remainder of the creative team who's kind of tagged along for this one, right? But yeah. So the movie is trying to reconnect with the Sidney Prescott's family, and the big dramatic arc underpinning it all is, I hope, the idea of looking at how the transference of trauma can influence another generation, the passing of the torch, it's not really a movie about Sidney Prescott anymore, but it's more about her daughter Tatum, about how the idea of her life, her identity is very much defined by the identity or the trauma that her mother went through. And this is an important sort of theme, I think, for the movie, because for many reasons, more on that in a second once more. all of it's a little bit, at least a little bit underbaked, and it's very difficult to like it for that reason, because there is a dramatic core underpinning it all, which is this sort of tight story about mother-daughter sort of dynamic, where they try to make sense of what the hell's happening to our family. How can I be myself when my mother is Sidney Prescott, the Scream Queen, the sort of the slayer of ghost face killers, right? The woman who's in the second Scream, she's just beautifully sure about the idea that actually, if you kill someone, you have to shoot them in the head, because they do come back, which is also a comment on the sort of the genre sort of traditions, right? But this is kind of what this movie is trying to be, and in that spirit, it reconnects with Scream 1 and Scream 2 in some visual sort of nods, trying to position Isabel May's character, so Tatum's character, as the de facto new Scream, the new Gen Z Scream Queen, someone who's going to go forward, hopefully, I don't know, maybe, and become the new protagonist in the ongoing series. I don't know. That's at least my assumption, right? And the reason I'm not sure about any of this is because, the movie is really terribly underbaked. And like, I rinsed in my review. I gave it 2 stars out of 5. I think critics overall rinsed it. Although the reasons why that might be the case may or may not have been political, although audiences seem to have liked it, like to the tune of $150 million at the box office globally thus far. This is already becoming one of the most successful films in this franchise, or at least on par with the previous two, right? And it's a question of like, why are people flocking to this? Is like, what are the reasons? Like, just driving people to the cinemas to see Scream 7, the 7th film in a long-standing horror franchise, is still. I suppose there's a separate conversation which I may or may not either write about or record a video about, maybe both, about why. Because I think there's something to be said about the positioning of the Scream franchise within the grand sort of big overarching mosaic of horror franchises, and how it's kind of sort of special in a way. But that's a topic for a different day. Today, what I want to find out, or I want to talk about a little bit about, is how a movie that with a number 7 in the franchise can become a mess, and why it almost feels like it's bound to happen. Why this is almost expected, and how the movie does or does not leverage that. Because, like, I called it a mess. Critics really didn't respond to it in any sort of positive way. Like 31% critical score on Rotten Tomatoes kind of sort of says it all, right? And there will be fans of it. Like, there will be someone out there, by the way. There will be one person out there who will be saying that Scream 7 is the best film in the franchise. I bet you money there's going to be at least one. There's always one. There's always one person who says Halloween 5 is their favorite movie of all time. There's always one. Like, I'm this close to being like the champion of Jaws the Revenge because I have a weirdly misplaced nostalgic reverence for the roaring shark. But but I'm fully aware of how stupidly dumb this movie looks. But I love it nonetheless. Where was I? Scream 7, right? So what's happening in here? Why is this movie a mess? And movies like this, in long-standing franchises, and this is an important distinction, long-standing franchises that have not yet been rebooted. This is a movie that effectively avoided a formal reboot, where you recast the people who would play the lead roles. And they avoided that specifically on the back of the nostalgia sequel wave, because you get to reboot while doing a sequel. Scream 5 calls it a requel, which is a word I find incredibly annoying, but that's also besides the point. So the movie hasn't, like, the whole franchise has not been formally restarted yet. So what we're dealing with here is a timeline that extends all the way back to the 90s, right? So a movie with a number 7 in the title that's still continuing the basic timeline established by Kevin Williamson and Wes Craven is going to have problems, because you will run out of reasons to make more movies, right? And one of the reasons why it probably hasn't been the case, apart from just being able to cash in on the nostalgia sequel vibes in 2022, right, with Scream 5, or how I like to call it 5 Scream, because that's how it was stylized on the poster, right, is is that in contrast to any other slasher franchise, pick one, like Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Child's Play, fucking Hatchet, any of them, right? You don't have a killer that you need to find reasons for bringing back from the dead, because it's a Scooby-Doo experience. Every single movie is a Scooby-Doo episode where what you have to do as part of the shtick is to find out who from among the people that you've already seen in the movie is the killer. Right? That's kind of the big deal. So what they are trying to do in here is, at least I suppose, like, the assumption was that this is kind of how you can live with this. And I think one of the beautiful things about this franchise, again, like more on that in a separate sort of rant video article, I don't know yet, is that with 7 installments you get to have some symmetry. And actually we almost had it, right? Because you have the Sidney Prescott trilogy, so Scream 1, 2, and 3. You have Scream 4, which kind of stands as the sort of the axis of symmetry because it's unconnected to anything. And then you had Scream 5, 6, and hopefully 7, where what you would have had would be the Sam Carpenter trilogy, which is centered around the character played by Melissa Barrera, who's the illegitimate daughter of Billy Loomis, who was one of the killers from the original film. Right, where you have this woman who's wrestling with the sins of her father, and she's haunted by the sort of the evil ghost of her dad, right? Which is an intriguing sort of piece of symmetry, because you get to follow Sidney Prescott, who's the survivor, victim turned hero, and you have on the other side of the ledger you have this sort of survivor turned hero who also anti-hero actually, who has to prove to herself and people around her that the past does not define her at all. Like, I find this almost poetic. This is almost probably one of the smartest things you would have found in any long-standing horror franchises, if it hadn't been for the fact that Melissa Barrera didn't get to star in this film, right? Which is kind of why, like, again, long-standing franchises, they don't fall apart because the script is bad. Right? The script is bad because the franchises fall apart before people step on set, before scripts are commissioned and written, before people are cast. Okay, they fall apart on the back of political upheavals, on the back of people tussling for power or arguing over the direction of the series, because they look at the numbers and say, we need to reinvent ourselves. Oh no, we have to continue with what we did before, but we have to do something new. We can't do more of the same. Oh, I know. How about let's lean into something fresh, and then becomes a problem. How do we retcon? What do we retcon? Where do we do these retcons? How do we retcon what and where and how and why? And that's how problems arise, right? But this one almost just was doomed to fail to begin with, because first of all, the original 2 directors, Penelope Olpin and Gillette, they didn't want to come back for the 7th one, and that was sort of like announced in March 2023. I think they just wanted to do other things, but they still wanted to stay kind of close enough to the production as executive producers to be able to exert influence if they needed, right? But they ended up making or directing Abigail, which is a real fun movie to watch. Link to my to my review in the description. So they exited the project. And also, just even rewind further back, so Neve Campbell, she came back for the 5th one because, like, I don't know, it was a series revival, and also it involved the David Arquette's character having a big moment in the series, which actually just made a lot of sense, just conceptually speaking. But yeah, like, she didn't come back for the 6th one because she wanted more money, and props to her. I mean, like, good on her that she wanted more money, because she's one of the more sort of recognizable, probably the one of the few still standing scream queens, right, in the genre. And she wanted more money, and they said no. I don't know. Spyglass had this movie budgeted for X amount of money, and they didn't have the money sort of lying around, I suppose, or this was a power play. I don't know, because like she asks for money, and Courtney Cox asks for more money, and everyone asks for more money, and they go like, no, we can't allow that. I don't know, but she didn't come back, so they had to invent a dodgy reason for Sidney to sit out the events of New York in Scream 6. Which are briefly mentioned in Scream 7 too, because she comes back for this one, right? More on that in a second. But yeah, so it's already, the franchise is kind of on like a shaky ground, because Nev Campbell's kind of out of the picture. The two directors are out of the picture, but they do find a replacement. That's Christopher Landon, a guy who directed Happy Death Day 2, and Freaky. So he's kind of like versed in this sort of meta, self-aware, post-slasher sort of space, you know? So they find this guy, and they write it. So Busick and Vanderbilt, they sit down to write a screenplay. And in November 2023, a month after the sort of the Hamas Gaza war starts, Melissa Barrera gets the boot from the production because she had been sharing Instagram posts which were distinctly pro-Palestine, and Spyglass Media Group thought they were anti-Semitic. I don't know. I don't want to make political statements in here. As far as I'm concerned, from the vantage point of where we are now, she was calling a spade, you know? That's what's been happening, and she gets fired for what Spyglass Media Group, who owns the franchise, thought was anti-Semitic comments. She doesn't sue the production, I don't think, but then again, like, this is like for anyone who has ever worked before and had to sign an employment contract, I have a feeling this is just something that you should expect. Like, if you go and make political statements that are a little bit more controversial than probably should be, you may actually have some trouble at work, right? And I'm pretty sure they had morality clauses in the contract. The movie hadn't started shooting just yet, so it's just easy to kick her out, and with like zero repercussions, like legally speaking. However, the repercussions come in the form of what the hell do we do with the movie? Because like they essentially booted the main character of the series, and with her as well, Jenna Ortega, almost like a day later, just quits the production. Initially reported in Variety and other places that scheduling conflicts with Wednesday. She quickly goes online and says, no, I'm leaving in protest, in solidarity. Which also, like, if you need to kind of put a bit of a caveat to this as well, because Melissa Barrera leaving means that this movie won't happen the way the way it should be, because how are you, like, you need to actually start from scratch. How are you going to, like, are you going to recast her and just pretend, like, is this going to be like the Oracle in the Matrix sequels? It's just like that woman died, right? But it's not going to be like that. They're just going to find another actress and pretend everything's hunky-dory. No. So they already know, like, stuff's going to get nixed and rewritten. So I think Jenna Ortega has a very short window of opportunity to make a statement, and she does, right? So props to her for actually going and saying, like, no, I'm leaving in protest, even though probably the writing was on the wall anyway. Which, because she played her half-sister, so, you know, if they don't recast the character, they have to get rid of her too, because they would be just rejigging the entire franchise. So like, she might as well go, right? So, but she went on her own volition, and she actually made a statement. Cool, right? Christopher Landon then goes like, what am I supposed to do in here? Like, I was hired to direct a movie. There was a plan in place, and now what? You know? So he goes, and then the production kind of is in limbo, right? And that, you can't really have a production in limbo where I think already the money has been sort of secured, which is loans from the bank have been obtained. There's money being burned, and you kind of have to do something. So they get on the phone with Kevin Williamson, the guy who wrote the first and the second Scream film, right, in the franchise, to go and say, hey, do you want to direct this movie? Sounds like a logical choice. But think about it for a second. This guy hasn't directed any feature film since 1999, and that's when he directed Teaching Mrs. Tingle, which was also a massive box office failure. Well, it was a massive box office failure, but there's probably more reasons to that, because I think it was also just, let's just say, unfortunately released right around the time of the Columbine massacre. So I think there's also some of that sort of clapback, you know. But it stands to reason that the movie wasn't good, right? And he had then, since then, he was doing exclusively TV, so he was developing Dawson's Creek, The Vampire Diaries, whatnot, right? But he hasn't worked as a director for 30 years nearly, and he comes back to direct it, and you can actually see it in the film. The film does not really have a good sense of there's a quality drop between Penelope Open Gillette sort of direction and this. You can see how blocking doesn't make sense sometimes. Certain scenes could have been more inspired than they are, and sometimes you just have very weird sort of lapses in sense of geography. You know, it's just like it's a messily looking picture, okay, which just adds to everything, right? So that's happening, right? However, so on top of Kevin Williamson, they also finally get Neve Campbell back. I have a feeling they've already agreed to pay her a little bit more because they need someone to anchor this movie, right? You can't have Melissa Barrera exit the film and just hire a bunch of nobodies now. Like, no one's gonna go and see this, right? And there's also a reason for it, right? And also on top of that, like, we need butts and seats. We already know this is a problem. And on top of everything, this whole movie is now being produced in the atmosphere of an incoming boycott because pro-Palestine activists or people who generally would be supporting Melissa Barrera, they just promise to boycott the film and they make a lot of noise about it, right? So there's also this looming threat of this movie becoming a bomb on the back of essentially just a boycott, right? So they hire Matthew Lillard to come back to reprise his role as Stu Macker, a character who died 30 years ago, to come back. At this point, I don't know what to expect, right? Because, you can say, oh, it's a long-standing franchise. They're gonna retcon a few things, and turns out he's never dead. But they also just do something even stupider because they very quickly in the film they reveal that it's not real Stu Macker who comes back. It's an AI deepfake because everything, like, if you add AI to a movie, it's like a get out of jail free card. You can just like paint yourself into a corner and say, AI, this is all fake or whatever. Move on, right? So that's kind of how this movie comes together. Like, it has this dramatic core that's trying to invent on the go because the dramatic arc of Melissa Barrera we kind of try to forget about. Like, the characters who have been transplanted from the Scream 6 into here almost pretend this woman doesn't exist, and what we have in here is an exercise in what makes this franchise great. How do we what do we leverage in here? What do we lean into? And this is where you actually have to go into franchise theory for a brief second and just say to yourself, what actually does the Scream franchise have that it needs to propagate to make sure that the next installment in the series would count as a Scream movie? I suppose, first of all, it needs to have a Ghostface killer. It's kind of like making a Halloween film without Michael Myers. They've tried it, didn't work, right? Also, anyway. So they tried it, didn't work. So you have to have Ghostface killer, and on top of everything, I think the big sort of plus that this franchise has always had, the big sort of ace in the hole, was the fact that they didn't ever have a single killer that they needed to revive. They had a Scooby-Doo experience every single time, right? Because it's always someone that you've seen in the film that has the mask in their pocket and a knife in their bag, So that's so that's what they need to do. They need to find someone to have a good enough reason to stalk Neve Campbell's character once more and her family, and just kind of sort of catalyze their dramatic relationship, like the passing of the torch and whatnot. This has to come from them being exposed to this trauma of having to deal with Ghostface once more, right? But the problem with that is also that the entire franchise, the unrebooted Scream franchise that's 30 years long now, has also behaved kind of like Star Wars. As in, it's never been sort of concerning itself with a rotating cast of characters. It's all about it's a family saga, right? It's all about Sidney Prescott having to find reason, like having to evade another killer, who's also somehow related to her through some weird way. It's either, it's Billy and Stu, it's Billy's mom, it's, in the third one, it's her half brother. In the fourth one, I fucking can't remember now. But you get the gist. There's always some kind of a tangential relationship, some like a distant relationship to the Sidney Prescott sort of circle that these people would have. Because if you just do a Scooby-Doo and take the mask off, and it's like, who are you? It's like, no, I'm just a guy. I just really liked stab movies. That's a good idea, actually. That's it. So you need to find either you need to find a character who you'd be able to bring back from the past, or like connect towards them in some way, but 7 films in, it becomes ridiculous because you're running out of people, because like Sidney Prescott just kills everyone, right? So at this point you'd have to go like, I don't know, I lived next door to Stumacher, and when they were staging this massacre and really kept me up at night, and I fell into depression, and I feel like this is all Sidney's fault, so now I'm gonna kill her. Like that's kind of the kind of stupidity you have to deal with, right? So it's either that, or let's pretend to do that. Let's burn the house down, which is what happens in the beginning of the film, and start afresh, you know? Let's pretend the past doesn't exist and do something new. Which is, ironically, what franchises do. This is not the first time this has happened, you know? This is something like, and this is kind of how I start to find interest in this film just as a whole, like as an experience, because you know, like I appreciate if people go to the cinema and say like, oh, just Ghostface is cool enough to look at because I like looking at this guy because he's scary and cool looking, and I like how he's a bit clumsy, always gets hit in the head and just kills people with a knife, right? Fair enough. It's a good enough reason, as in like I like Michael Myers. I want to see movies with Michael Myers. Kudos, you know. Or the Scooby-Doo, like I want to see who's going to be the killer today, you know. Kudos, you know. But for me, this isn't enough, especially not in a movie that's so thoroughly underbaked, dramatically and directed with the sense of flair of like a, you know, like a student film, you know. It's like it's not enough, right? So, which is also kind of like held back with Scotch tape, good intentions, and stickers that say AI everywhere. In every single place where something doesn't make sense, it's just like slap AI on it and it's gonna work, right? I need a little bit more, right? And this is where it becomes interesting to me, because what I like to see this movie as an example of is, or maybe the idea of liking it includes what I call the meta approach. You know, this isn't the first time that a horror film with like a number 7 or 6 or whatever, a long-standing franchise, became a mess. It's almost a part of a tradition, right? Michael Myers, like Season of the Witch, was a famous misfire. Like, let's ditch Michael Myers. Do we need Michael Myers in the first place? Forget the fact that, you know, like the original Halloween sort of idea was not supposed to be centered around a single killer. It was supposed to be like an anthology series. Yeah, so let's do that, you know. And that didn't work. Like what was it, like Halloween 6, The Curse of Michael Myers? They want this movie to like lean into the sort of pagan cult stuff, and that movie was taken away from its director and retooled by producers. So like political messiness is a part of the job, right? The Exorcist series, boy. Like I mentioned, you know, The Exorcist is essentially one of the greatest movies of all time, followed by a string of what the hell, you know? Starting with Heretic, The Exorcist 2, The Heretic, with James Earl Jones. That's like, I think of this movie, I see James Earl Jones in a grasshopper outfit, you know? That's kind of what I think about. I don't know what this movie was trying to do, right? Because they knew we need to have Pazuzu, we need to have Linda Blair. And they had Richard Burton, who I don't know if he was sober at the time, right? And then you have like 2 prequels. Like essentially, they had a movie that was made twice because Paul Schrader was commissioned to make a movie. He had an idea to make a prequel about how, you know, like Father Merrin first encountered Pazuzu, and the producers were like, "This is terrible." They shelved it and they hired Rennie Harlin to essentially shoot this movie again. But then the Schrader film was released. Now we have 2. You can watch Dominion. You can watch the Exorcist, the beginning. And they essentially tell the same story twice, and you can see how they're just heaps of mess in just 2 different flavors, right? And there's also like the Jaws series where you have to invent reasons for the shark to come back, and you know every time there's a different shark, and in the 4th one they have one that roars and has telepathic connection with the Brody family for no reason, because it's like is this like a related shark? Is it like a grandchild of the original shark? I don't know, but you know what I mean, like. The messiness is a part of the operation. And actually, in fact, this series, in a way, is kind of sort of slightly symmetrical to what happened in the Jason series in Friday the 13th, because at some point, they actually decided, they were like, well, we can't just bring Jason back again, you know? How stupid can this be? You know? So what do we do? oh, I know, let's democratize, because it's a guy behind a mask. So it could be anyone behind this mask. What if we get a copycat killer? And that's how The New Beginning kind of just ended up becoming a reality. And that was rejected wholesale by audiences. Again, there's probably one person out there who goes like, Friday the 13th, The New Beginning is my favorite film in the franchise. And there's probably another one somewhere else saying like, this is actually my favorite film in the world, in history of all time. But that's regardless, right? But what they then did was like, no, this was a mistake. Let's retcon all this. Let's bring Jason back in Jason Lives. So you can almost see how this movie kind of is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is how I actually prefer to look at it. Like, it's actually interesting to me that this movie, maybe like the meta commentary that this movie just exercises itself is very shallow, very surface level, because it just leans back towards the original, like the sort of Drew Barrymore playing with the knife. That's a visual, like you can imagine this sort of Leonardo DiCaprio meme from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Like, this is the depth of the meta commentary that Kevin Williamson engages in here with this screenplay as well, and like in visuals as well, where where you see like Tatum's boyfriend just doing these, because he saw Stab 1 and he goes like, oh, Stab was on TV, and he pretends to be Billy Loomis and whatever. And they go back to Scream 2, where like Tatum stars in the play, but she plays a dog, and meanwhile like Sydney in Scream 2 was like a Cassandra, and you can see the sort of the dynamic of, she was a very promising actress. Meanwhile, like the director of her school play, Tatum's school play, he says, oh, you're not good. Like I would imagine that you'd have some of your mother's fire in you or whatever. You can see like they're trying to stage this, but how this comes out is kind of terrible. But you can see how what's actually interesting to me is that the mess with firing of Barrera and trying to retool everything and democratize Ghostface, because now you almost have to just invent characters who'd be wearing the mask, and you have to find progressively stupid reasons for them to do so, essentially becomes this, as in like the mask could be anyone. They could just be a guy who feels like I don't know, like I feel like killing today, let's put on a mask. And it doesn't even have to concern Sidney Prescott at this point, right? The fact that it does just shows me that they didn't really have a good enough reason not to. Well, the reason was, if we fired that woman and we don't bring that woman back, and like, what do we have? Because they still feel like the franchise, it runs on facial recognition. so yeah, that's kind of how I see the movie actually makes sense to me. Like, this is how I don't like it, but I'm talking myself into liking it, because it actually is like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Even though they failed to capitalize on the symmetry, like 3 + 1 + 3, like I mentioned, they don't do that. But you can see how you could see this plan was in action, and they failed to recognize this, or they failed to capitalize on this. And because franchises fell apart in the past, that one has to fall apart as well, because it's part of the tradition. You can't have a long-standing successful franchise, and this one is uniquely successful, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. It actually defies the rules of horror franchises. So maybe even, and I'm pretty sure this is not in the playbook for this movie. No one ever sat down and said like, we have to deliberately make a terrible movie that makes no sense, that makes stupid decisions, that we will either have to retcon next year or double down until we hire Rob Zombie to reboot it formally with a new cast, and just do Rob Zombie's Scream, where you'll just have a new Sidney Prescott who's going to be played by, I don't know who, some 21-year-old pretending to be 17, right? I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's what they're doing here. I don't think they have the sort of the level of distance required to recognize this. They are operating at a surface level, and this is where the way of having fun with this movie, the way I do, requires a lot of legwork on your behalf, or my behalf, really. You have to do some, like, you have to like read into this and just rationalize on your own time, So at this point, I actually am a little bit not anxious, but I'm actually quite excited for the eighth one, because I would like to see whether they'll retcon, or whether they'll double down, or I don't know. Or they will just go a completely new direction, which also speaks to how successful the franchise is probably going to continue to be, right? Because you can have fun. I mean, I'm pretty sure people have fun with just going to see Ghostface on the screen, then that's good enough for them. Or or they like the Scooby-Doo experience. I like to have fun with this movie in this unique way. But I think there's whatever they do, eventually the diminishing returns will have to kick in, and it's a question of when this happens and how, right? But it doesn't seem to be happening now because this movie is insanely successful. I mean, almost as successful as any other movie in this franchise. And this is kind of where my worry comes into place, because something tells me, because like there's there's this idea of this boycott. People are being very vocal online, like Thoughts and Prayers, cancel Paramount Plus, which I also have some thoughts about, because like last time I remember people saying things like this online was when the live action Mulan was being made in China and the Xinjiang province, where Uyghur Muslims are being mistreated, and people were talking about canceling Disney Plus. I don't think people cancelled. It's all about it's like all wind no poo, if you know what I mean, So if you want to boycott Paramount Plus, who actually doesn't hold the rights to the franchise but holds the rights to its distribution, you have to, I think, do a little bit more than that. But I'm not here to educate people on how to protest. I'm here to just, I don't know, make sense of why this movie is a success, even though it's blatantly a mess. And then on top of whatever I already mentioned, the reason I could see this as being successful is is because the idea of liking or disliking it falls along political lines, and that's a bit worrying to me, because now it becomes almost like a tell. Because if you say to someone, "Oh, I like Scream 7," "Oh, are you a MAGA cultist?" or something like this, or "Are you pro-Israel?" Because people make these connections, because like you can't really just like something, you have to subscribe to whole constellations of beliefs on top of everything. But it kind of looks like this, as in, either you hate this movie even or refuse to see it, and that means you're pro-Palestine, or you go to spite the libs or whatever, and watch it and watch it sort of aggressively just to prove that that these people are wrong, and you're pro-Israel or something like this, or you're a right winger. I have a feeling this may be a factor in here, and it's going to be impossible to disentangle this from the three reasons I mentioned before. I'd like to think that it's not the case. I'd like to think that people are kind of smart enough to just say, I just like this franchise. I like this killer. I like this setup. I like the sort of the meta self-awareness. I like how like weirdly 90s it continues to be, even though we're like way past due date in here. Or I like the Scooby-Doo aspect of trying to suss out who the killer is based on like these sort of, or just follow all these red herrings and following down these rabbit holes and whatever. Maybe that's the case. Or maybe I like the maybe I like the meta commentary. I like what this movie wants to say about the franchise or its own place within it, even though this one doesn't, right? So the Ghostface factor in here, very uninspired. The Scooby-Doo factor in here, very uninspired and patchy. The meta commentary, very surface level. The only way I can see it's possible for me to like it is the way I described it, through just commenting on the fact that this is a self-fulfilling prophecy through this like double meta approach. But yeah, time will tell. So I don't know. Tell me what you think about this. Is this like a movie that you have to like if you like Paramount, or like do you have to make a political statement by liking or disliking this film, or what is it, right? So yeah, that's what I think about Scream 7. It's a bad movie that I want to like, and I'm slowly talking myself into liking it on the back of this sort of approach that I've just described. So if you want, read my full review or an article I wrote about this movie, like link in the description, and follow me for more. Read, I don't know, subscribe. And there's going to be some more content, I think, about this, because I think I have more stuff to say about this, sort of the franchise and this movie as a whole. So yeah, take care.